Economist says, it's all in your heads, people. Just listen to an economist's comments on the state of the economy. I won't name her, because I don't want her harassed. And I doubt she'll change her mind anyways. She's deep in denial. All I will say is that she is an economist and once had a job at the Federal Reserve Board and is taking a survey on Twitter, X. Well, she wanted to know why aren't Americans happy that the unemployment rate is lower and the inflation is down. Well, she receives a whole host of good answers. And her conclusion is, there is a disconnect between the people and economic reality. She keeps repeating, a disconnect, and says that people are upset because they have smartphones. Telling us all this bad news. I don't even know what to say to types like her anymore. There is always a disconnect, but it's between economists and reality. They have a little set of models based on poor assumptions and then they complain that the world doesn't fit their models. You'll find there are two types of economists. Those that concern themselves with people, and those that defend the wealthy at all costs. You will not believe the mental gymnastics the latter group will go through when confronted with real data showing that the world is actually going through. Nothing makes me madder than to hear economic data versus perception. As if the real-world prices we pay are somehow not real but something we incorrectly believe we see. Oh, this the Will Standstill argument. People are actually doing great, they've just been fooled into thinking they're doing bad because of the mean old media, completely divorced from people's material realities and just all in on gaslighting. There's parts of the economy that are doing better. But how that is experienced by average people varies. The cost of housing is still ridiculous and rising much faster than wages. Ditto medical care and education. The only needs that people have that are falling are gasoline and some food prices. But real wages are up. They are. But that's in aggregate. Many sectors haven't raised wages sufficient to keep up with the pace of inflation for years. Some of those rising wages were only because of changing local and federal labor standards that forced them to reluctantly raise wages as little as they possibly could. Economic indicators don't capture things like hours of unpaid overtime being worked due to fear of being laid off, or the stressful effects of being understaffed for months that stretch into years. Because economic indicators were invented by capitalism to serve capital's interests, not workers. It's because rich people don't socialize, work with, talk to poor people. The rich are doing fine and so are all of their friends. So the rest of us must be just wrong. I think that the economic measurements are insufficient to capture the meaningful results for people. Economists seem to believe these metrics are infallible. Here's one source discussing this. https://ppc.sas. upenn.edu/learnmore/measuring wellbeing nations. Brief intro statement from that. There is growing awareness, however, that economic measures alone do not fully reflect a nation's progress and well-being. Multidimensional measures of well-being can supplement economic indicators to more accurately represent how a nation is doing and to better inform public policy. This isn't some fringe idea of undereducated or unsuccessful complainers. This concept is developed and agreed upon in reputable circles. There is plenty of research demonstrating the fact that economic measures simply cannot capture overall well-being, and further cannot even capture economic opportunity and equity. It would be frankly childish at this point to believe that when economic measures butts heads with public sentiment that you would favor economic measures and not seek to find the further measures that can capture and lead to resolution of the clearly occurring situation. That aside, given that economic measures are simply factually unable to capture what it is being pitted against. Economic measures have also not been updated to reflect some drastic changes in how the current economy works, compared to the function when the current measures were formed and considered to be a good capture of the overall picture. It is highly likely that new metrics and bounding comparisons, ratios, etc., can be developed to improve on economic reporting itself, which, again, still will only be one piece of the puzzle in overall well-being for the people. Here's a brief example of this being discussed from the World Economic Forum. https://www.weforum.org/agenda/2021/05/GDP New Measure Economic Growth/. This is not some fringe complaint. It is well understood by reputable professionals that economic measurement is a dynamic challenge, and that we are currently facing a disconnect between traditional means of measuring such and what counts in today's economies. It is also well understood that economic measurement alone does not reflect the overall condition for people living within those economies. The trickle-down model has permeated pretty much all academic concepts of economics. If the companies are wealthy, and the shareholders are wealthy, and the stock market is doing well, then it's just stupid people complaining because they're too stupid to be wealthy. Those who are not looking at this through the wealth gap lens is lying to themselves. The economy cannot be considered good until the average worker can afford a house, a new car, healthcare, retirement, and college, all on one salary. I don't see that happening for a long time. If unemployment is record low and people still struggle to pay for utilities and food, maybe the problem isn't unemployment, but the lack of living wages. Whole lot of economists assuming that when companies are doing well, then the workers are. That hasn't been true since 1974, when improvements in productivity was decoupled from the average worker's income. And where did all that profit go? Right into the top 1%. And last year, while talking about increased costs from inputs and labor, they massively increased costs to consumers and pocketed that. It included some inflation, but most of that was greed. Economists do not generally look at buying power, average or mean wages, or net versus gross wages. They look at numbers that deal with corporations. It's misleading at best, and Stockholm Syndrome at worst. Housing is still unaffordable. We just went through more than a year of bad inflation. Wages haven't caught up, and people have to make payments on their student loans again. Sure, economy is doing great. Line go up versus I can't afford what I used to be able to when I made a lot less money. One is a chart based on a model based on assumptions that are curated to bolster the rich and powerful. The other is the reality the majority of people face daily. Trying to convince someone like myself who lost their job over 6 months ago that unemployment is low and wages are rising when everyone is trying to pay me half of what I made before while costs are way up isn't going to result in a hallelujah moment. So, food prices don't affect her bottom line because she is in blissful ignorance given her level of privilege. A can of pinto beans costs like $2.29 now. There's a lot of this going around lately. I'm low-key trying to understand its source, as it seems to have two potential sources: willful ignorance, or sheer stupidity because the person in question is disconnected. It's absolutely crazy to see economists and politicians blindly pointing at inflation reducing a bit while squawking about how we're all good now. Recession avoided. Let's all buy housed now. Meanwhile, it's a damn struggle to survive for most everyone I know. Sometimes I think the elite are well aware there's a large movement growing towards worker solidarity, and more than a bit of movement towards revolutionary mindsets. If that's the case, could be performance theater? The economy is doing well because the health of the economy, as it's defined in America, does not measure how the working class is doing. There's plenty of jobs now. I know, I have 3 of them and still can't afford rent. Quote. Her conclusion is, there is a disconnect between the people and economic reality. She's right, there is a disconnect, mainly because we live in the actual physical reality. Face with rolling eyes. There is a disconnect between the people and economic reality. There probably is. Often the disconnect is that while the economic fundamentals are good, people are not feeling the benefits because they are not getting more pay, lower prices, etc., because of the greed corporations, executives, and the rich. It is why doing the job one was hired to do during the hours one agreed to is labeled as quitting. It is also like how physicists will come up with idealized solutions to problems that don't work, because they use idealized objects and there are no spherical chickens in a vacuum. Economists won't ever come to useful conclusions until they accept that economics is not a natural science in any way, and they use math incorrectly most of the time too. It is a social science, first and foremost. So the perception that people have of the economy and their situation and position in it is 100% valid data. It's not a disconnect between economic data and perception. It's a disconnect between economists and the data. They are ignoring half of the dataset.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.